Today I'm sitting with Ralph Horne at RMIT and Trivess Moore. And we are going to be talking about housing and an amazing project that both have been working on through RMIT about housing and how to retrofit our existing stock and how to make it energy efficient, because in this day and age we have got a fossil fuel crisis, lots of renewable energy, but big barriers to transforming our housing stock. But Ralph, would you mind explaining to me what you do here, your title and your general work, and then we'll ask Trivess.
Sure. I'm currently Associate Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research for the College of Design and Social Context here at RMIT, which spans 8 schools, from education through the humanities, social sciences, covers the built environment, of course, and social science of the built environment.
Thank you. And Trivess.
So I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Property Construction and Project Management here at RMIT.
Oh, fantastic. So what is the big project that you're working on at the moment? We could start with that and then talk about the macro picture and how hard it is to get, and then the micro is how hard it is to get change happening.
I'll kick off and by all means chip in, Trivess. But both Trivess and I have been working on an Australian Research Council linkage project with state government and a number of other industry partners for, a 6-year period. It spanned the COVID, seemed to go on for a long time, called Housing Energy Efficiency Transitions. And the focus of that project, really the genesis of it, was to think beyond what I would describe as the kind of classic energy efficiency gap type dialogue that we have around housing stock, both here in Australia, but also across the westernised world, really, which is, why aren't we retrofitting our housing for energy efficiency at a faster rate, given the fact that the benefits outweigh the costs over time, logically, financially, and in lots of rational ways it makes sense to do so, to make these upgrades. There's also the added pressures of us needing to deal with climate change and mitigate meet our obligations and improve comfort and so on in our homes. So why is it that we're not doing this? And I think that to date, hope has been placed in technology upgrades and in behaviour change, neither of which have delivered the kinds of rates of retrofit that are needed. So we wanted to look beyond technology and behaviour change.
Wow. How do you get beyond technology and behaviour change? What's the next tool available there?
Well, the first thing we did was we decided not to go to households and tell them what needed to happen.
Is that a first?
we went into households. We didn't even mention energy efficiency.
Okay.
We went and asked households inside their homes to give us a tour of their homes, to talk as we were walking around taking photos about why they were where they were, where they'd lived as a child, what their ambitions were for their home. Everybody likes to talk about their homes, at least in most cases. Even if they're renting, they're happy to talk about their home, how they've come to be in their home, what their aspirations and ambitions are for the future. And generally what happened during that kind of 90-minute conversation was energy efficiency would emerge, either specifically using those words, or people would talk about the fact that it was uncomfortable, that it was drafty, and that they were trying to figure out how to fix it. And when they got this or that or so on, they were going to do it, or some of them were halfway through. Some talked about how they'd fixed up houses previously, but lots of other things came out, like, my father built this house, and I don't like to change it because it's a memory of him, or my partner did, and so on and so forth. So there are lots of kind of, if you like, meanings and if you like, an affective or emotional cues that also play out that are not really, I suppose, amenable to behaviour change in the conscious sense. There are other sets of logics sitting around home improvements and energy efficiency that we wanted to draw out from this research. So really a starting point was to think about housing upgrades as a capability. What are the kind of capabilities that households have, whether that's knowledge, sets of meanings, about what should be done, what are the rules, if you like, both legislative in terms of policy.
Rules in terms of, transforming a big range
Indeed.
of housing, you mean?
Yeah, but also rules in a more informal sense, the kind of what do other people do, standards and so on.
Oh, okay.
Tacit rules.
Yeah.
So, I think double glazing is really important because of people I know are getting it, or I'm getting solar because other people are.
Yeah.
And what's the kind of how do people compare themselves and their own aspirations and what's expected? We found a lot of households, householders that we spoke to were not really thinking about themselves either. They were thinking about other household members. They've got, children to care for. They're worried about their comfort or their health or the indoor pollution from whatever it might be.
Were they aware of indoor pollution from gas appliances, etc.?
Many people are.
Right.
So there's this myriad of different things happening. We spoke to over 160 households in their homes.
Wow.
This is quite expensive research to do, and time consuming. And those interviews took place across 2 states, South Australia and Victoria, across the months of the year, and in 2 areas in both states. One area around Melbourne and another in the Latrobe Valley. Another around Mount Gambier and around Adelaide. So
you got a nice cross section.
We wanted to try and get a bit of a sense. We obviously did some work on what we could get on data in terms of in Victoria, the Victorian energy efficiency upgrades that had been documented prior to doing the research. So we had a bit of an idea of where these kind of upgrades were taking place. But when we selected the households, we were really looking for these kind of other motivations and aspirations for why people do what they do in their homes.
Did you interview people that were actually part of the program of energy efficiency upgrades as well? Were they randomly selected?
So,
for instance,
reasonably randomly. Depends what you mean by random.
Well, I mean,
we did.
You included some.
We included people who had had upgrades done. We included people that were member of community groups that were looking to, improve energy efficiency, but we weren't only targeting that segment of kind of, conscious energy efficiency households. We wanted a wide range of households that covered a whole gamut,
including the vulnerable low-income households.
I was just going to say exactly. So about 40% of the households we interviewed were, formally or, by some measure, low income. And part of a focus of the research was to try to understand how, we were less interested, I suppose, in people who were more than able to afford upgrades.
You weren't certainly right. Okay.
So we wanted to understand how people navigated.
Did you include people who could afford the work as well?
Yes,
for
sure. The whole gamut.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So what was your role in it, Trivess?
Yeah, so I was one of the lead researchers and was out there doing some of these interviews and the analysis. And I guess the other point to add to some of the research we were doing is there was the focus on the households and understanding their experiences, their kind of challenges. But we also went out to the retrofit industry as well.
I see that in the overview of the research, which is really interesting. What did you pick up from the industry and the preparedness for this?
Yeah, or perhaps the lack of. In some cases. So there's a whole range of different people out there
shocked.
Providing information, services, and what have you to households, and they're all coming at it from slightly different kind of motivations as well. So we've got
they all want to make money within the business, right?
Yeah, largely you need to make money. You need to be profitable. But we spoke to some companies who would advocate for their technology, their service as the right solution.
Yeah.
Until you unpick that a little bit, and it becomes clear that actually that's because that's the technologies that their parent company is supplying, and so that's why
not necessarily the best. Okay.
And clearly there's a range of knowledge and expertise out there. You know, speak to some people who would advocate quite strongly still for, you know, gas, hot water, gas cooking and these types of things.
Okay.
Whereas others had made that shift or that pivot and kind of could see that electrification kind of pathway coming. We also spoke to some of the companies in the industry who are doing kind of one-off retrofit type activities through to those who are trying to deliver kind of more bundled services.
What do you mean by the one-off?
So it might be that they just, you know, do solar panels, for example.
Oh, okay. So one element of the okay.
Yeah. And so one of the things coming out quite strongly from the households is firstly knowing where to start, but also if you have to reach out to 5 different retrofitters and get 5 different sets of quotes for kind of different services, it can make things quite challenging for their household there. And so I guess part of coming out of this research, but also some of the wider discussion in Australia at the moment is, you know, how do you make the industry work a little bit better? And how can we start to think about kind of, you know, that kind of one-stop shop type idea where consumers could go to 1 or 2 you know, parts of the industry, get the required quotes and work, but also have trust in what they're getting. And so this was something else that I think came out strongly from both the industry side of things as well as the households, is that there's this challenge around trust. So householders had you know, low levels of trust in the industry, which then made it harder for them to understand kind of what they should be doing. And on the industry side of things, there wasn't always a strong focus on kind of communication and building that trust with consumers. It was
because it's a long-term play, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, I mean, how many people or how many businesses are actually involved in actually providing an overall view? This is what you need as a package, because that seems to be what you're telling me, that the householder wants someone to come in, like, you know, we used to speak to the Moreland Energy Foundation, which have now changed their names to something else, I think. But they, you know, they would have had a lot of trust, you know, and they went to people and would give them a complete overview and saying, this is where you start with solar. This, my sister did it, you know. I said, you've got to get on. And she rang them and they were terrific. And, you know, so who is doing that now, and what kind of body can generate that kind of trust? Can it be a private company, or does it need to be a semi-government authority of some sort?
Yeah, I think it can be created, and I think that there are some trusted intermediaries out there doing some of this work.
What sort of companies are they, or businesses, or outfits?
So there's, for example, in Victoria, there's a collection of different kind of what I would call retrofitters who have come together under the branding of 3EA, which is the Energy Efficiency Alliance, I think. And they essentially are bringing installation, they're bringing the heat pumps, they're bringing all the different elements of retrofit together to try and package themselves as a more trusted bundle of retrofit. Now, partly they're doing that, I think, to position themselves for some of the larger scale retrofit programs that are around, but also...
What do you mean larger scale?
So like government retrofit of existing social housing.
Oh, okay, so big bundles of work, yeah.
And part of that is there's then efficiencies, because you've got everything kind of under one roof, but also in terms then of kind of quality control as well. And so I think that the challenge is when you have, you know, you talk to one person about one particular product, service, material, of course you're going to get their bias and say, yes, you need to do this. Whereas if you step back and say, what is best for this house?
Absolutely,
but also in terms of taking into consideration the householder context, then that might change the situation in terms of what to do and in kind of what order and kind of what makes sense to do that. And so I think that what Australia's been missing largely is, where do you get that independent information from? And so we saw the Victorian government develop the scorecard a number of years ago, which was an attempt to go into people's houses and do that assessment, that independent assessment for households, to give them that information as a starting point for, you should be doing these things to improve, and this is kind of the recommended order, you know, that you could do those. So then you could go out and you could make sure you weren't necessarily either doing the wrong kind of retrofits, or the things that perhaps weren't the best value there.
That sounds like a really good idea. Ralph, you've got some views on scorecard and what's replacing it, which is the Matters rating for existing homes.
Yeah. Look, I think one thing I will say, just going back a step, and I'll come to your point, Tina. The project set out to find out how people understand their homes and approach retrofitting without sort of biasing the process by actually putting the words of retrofit and energy efficiency into people's heads. And there are lots of complexities, of course, lots of things to do with how households plan for their housing careers and housing futures and so on.
Yeah.
Lots to say about this. But if we had to probably draw one thing out of the entire project, I think it would be that there is no single source of truth about how your home compares and what needs to be done to it. So in the absence of that, in that lacuna, if you like, that kind of gap, what happens is that people end up having to trust whoever they trust, find whoever they can, who will give them a reasonable, plausible idea of what needs to be done. Now, in some cases, that is reasonably comprehensive, like following the lines of the previous thread of this discussion. And in other cases, it's not really. It's like, well, you can do this, but that doesn't really connect to other things. And so I think undoubtedly the absence of some form of, the equivalent of the appliance labelling scheme that we have for fridges and whatever else we have in our homes, they all have star ratings. We all know roughly, how they compare. We don't have that equivalent in existing housing, and that is a huge gap.
Does that exist in other countries? Because you've got a global view of things.
So the Europeans, of course, have had a directive in place for 20 years. They have mandatory disclosure at point of sale or lease. It's embedded. Now, I won't say it's perfect, but there's absolutely no doubt that when people go to rent a place or to buy a place, all that energy efficiency labelling is there, and they can factor that into their decisions. Still, there are overheated housing markets. There are reasons why people will buy lower energy efficiency or rent lower energy efficiency, but it's factored into a range of different considerations that they have. We don't have that here. People are not afforded that possibility, and basically they're denied information about what they're going to rent or buy.
Yes, I'm busting to ask you how you think that can change and what we need to do in this country. But also I want to know, like, sort of just stepping back a little bit, the people that you were sort of open questioning, like it's an open thing, not directed in any way. Did they want to improve their homes? Did they bring it up saying, I want to improve the comfort of my home?
So everybody wants to improve their homes, bar none, practically. There are people that it's not this home they're going to improve because they're waiting. They're waiting for whatever it could be. There's a myriad of different things that mean that people are stuck in a place and anticipating something to happen. But they also have ambitions for home improvements. The question is, what are those ambitions? And on what are they based? So,
Gotcha.
So, in the absence of having for
data
someone who,
and comparables,
so someone who's always lived in a very poorly, sort of constructed dwelling that's got lots of leaks, they may not really understand what a comfortable home is like.
Yeah.
Those who have experienced it, even if it's, temporarily, might have some idea, or have been into friends or families' homes which have had double glazing or proper insulation fitted, and the gaps and cracks sealed up. They might have some idea of what a 6-star, 7-star home is like, but but there is no kind of standard understanding. So I think that weighs heavily, really. It means that people are using their own barometer, and they don't have a way of calibrating that really into kind of what we might call a set of expectations. And this is where I would link to new homes, is that, you know, our ambitions for the energy efficiency of new homes have lagged behind the Western world.
And getting worse as the certain development lobbies, housing lobbies push to have them. I mean, Victoria brought the new NCC in the other day, but others are putting it on ice because of the energy efficiency provisions largely.
Yeah.
They don't want to tackle that.
Which,
I mean, in this climate, do you think that might change?
I mean, I clearly the fossil fuel crisis that we are currently living through, if that doesn't change things, then one has to question what will. It's very clear to me that with the imperative to end the use of fossil fuels, and with the cost of fossil fuels spiraling because of wars and so on, these factors come together, and surely must be another motivator to do something at the national level. But, you know, one of the first pieces of research I did in 2005 for what was then the Australian Greenhouse Office, remember we used to have one of those, was comparing the stringency, energy efficiency stringency of the National Housing Code at that point with jurisdictions overseas. We collected house plans from across the US and Europe. We modelled them using accurate, and kind of situated those climate zones in comparative climate zones in Australia. So, for example, in Melbourne, we used homes from San Francisco Bay. In Perth, we used. We went to Arizona, and so on and so forth across the country. And the average of all of those assessments in 2005 was 7.3 stars. So we still haven't got to 7 stars in Australia 20 odd years later. And since then, the US has had at least 2 upgrades of its national construction code equivalent. We have lagged behind the rest of the world, and the US is not known as being a kind of green leader.
No,
in this space, so it's not as,
and it's not mandated. It must be industry led there, or does it mandated in, to have certain standards of energy efficiency?
Yeah, no, it is. I mean,
it is mandated by the states and cities too.
Indeed, there's lots of complexity in it. Of course, there are. You can declare yourself a free state, I'm told, in the US, but even there, in Phoenix, in Arizona, which, as I said before, we used for the Perth comparisons. Phoenix has its own city code. So, there are different jurisdictions involved in this. But look, the long and the short of it is new housing relates to the retrofit that we're talking about here, because if you're using double or triple glazing in your new housing, the cost of that double, triple glazing comes right down because of the volumes, because of the manufacturing, because of the learning rates, because of the installers and so on, and that finds its way into retrofit. If you don't have it in new housing, then it's astronomically expensive to retrofit it into housing. So it does matter. Getting our act together on the quality of new housing is important for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
It's important because it future-proofs our housing so that we don't have to retrofit it so much, and retrofit is always more expensive than doing it once and doing it well. But it also affects the structure, conduct, performance of the supply chains, the technologies that we're installing, the industries that are installing them. So there are a lot of kind of connections between the new build industry and what you might call the retrofit industry.
Yeah. So, Trivess, what did you sense was the biggest? You're both in the position where you're watching policy and from industry and government. What do you sense would be the biggest transformative action we could take here, because we are lagging so far behind? Where's the points of, what do they call it, transition, inflection?
Yeah, really important question. I think for existing housing, clearly the research shows that we've been doing that, we need clearer information, more trusted information for households as a starting point so that they can know what to do and where to start from. But also then having the industry there to be able to deliver at scale. Like, I think, the back of the envelope kind of calculation is between now and 2050, if we are to decarbonise the existing kind of housing stock, is like one deep retrofit every 2 minutes or something kind of ridiculous like that. And so you start to go, okay, do we have the people who can deliver at that kind of scale? And unfortunately, at this point in time, we see that that's not the case. And so we need to have a stronger industry. We need to probably have better checks and balances across the industry. And so we're starting to see some of that come in to make sure we don't repeat some of the mistakes of the past. And we need to really be thinking about what are those economies of scale.
Oh, yeah.
How can you go to a street or a suburb and just target, collection of things and move away from doing one-off things? So we see lots of, government rebates for doing this or that. And how about, try and get something more collective?
And one of the strongest motivators for change, I've been told, is when people see someone in their street putting solar on the roof and they go, oh, well, my neighbour's done it, it must be good. Yeah. Someone's tested the ground.
And this is one of the challenges for retrofit, is that a lot of the low-hanging fruit is invisible. So insulation is probably one of the first things that most people can do. But many people can't walk into a room or into a house and go, I know that there's insulation in the ceiling. And so trying to make some of that more visible for people, I think, is really important, so that they can kind of understand.
A star rating on the front door. Why not?
Idea. Exactly.
They do it for commercial buildings.
I mean, the idea of a roadworthy, we have it for cars.
Yeah, we do.
Why don't we have it for houses, which is our biggest single asset? And,
but why not? You guys ought to have the answer here. What's missing in Australia? What would you like to see?
It's a policy gap, and I think we all know why it's there. There are different tiers of government involved in this. They rarely align. It's let's say politicized. There's a lot of different actors involved with their own particular interests, and I think things have moved, and they've moved forward and backwards.
Yeah,
iteratively are kind of moving in the right direction, but clearly, if you're talking about silver bullets, of which clearly there are none, but the nearest we've got is probably making sure that we have a clear, simple, navigable regime which allows us to understand. If I want to rent a place or buy a place, I know what has been done, what needs to be done, and how it compares to other.
It seems. Look, I'm sorry to bang on like this, but I always get the feeling that the state governments have got their hands tied behind their backs. Victoria, and yet I want to ask you as well, Trivess, that Victoria has been, to me it seems to be ahead of everyone in all its programs that it has. Solar Victoria, Sustainability Victoria. You mentioned the, what was it before? You mentioned some other program. The scorecard came out of Victoria. If it can't get its act together,
Yeah, I think it's fair to say some states are doing more than others, and I think what
like who's doing more? Victoria
is leading the way, I think, in some areas. We see, for example, with improvements to private rental housing, and we see other states like New South Wales now starting to look into this more closely.
They actually look like being the first to mandate mandatory disclosure for housing.
Yes, absolutely. So
there is good news.
Yeah. It, as Ralph said, there's a lot of politics at play here.
Yes.
I think that it's much easier for politicians to focus on new housing, to have photos in front of new housing, to make announcements. But to go back to one of your kind of earlier questions, in terms of some of that change that we need to move beyond just repeating the same kind of announcements to starting to change those structural issues. So, we're talking about retrofit here, but for new housing, don't just announce we're going to build another 1 million houses, but how are we going to do that? Because the current processes are taking longer. There's a whole range of issues there. So just announcing a number and expecting things to change is is not really going to work. So how do we get more trades in?
You mentioned that about the industry skills that are missing and the capacity. What are the most urgent to fill there?
I think it's across the board. I think the insulation industry has spoken time and time again about the challenges of keeping people employed and paid properly, particularly because things like insulation are very kind of cyclical in terms of, it starts warming up or it starts getting colder, and that's when people pay attention. And so you get a rush of work, but how do we get the consistency of work across the year? And I think that the same we see with some of the technologies. So whenever the battery announcement, for example, we see a whole lot of battery installs going in now, and as the rebates start to kind of phase out, I'm sure there'll be an impact on delivery there. And so we need to think about consistency, but also I think that holistic delivery. So we need.
I love that idea to go into a suburb and just target that one.
Yeah, and it's hard because every property is slightly different, but there's got to be better ways of doing this.
And it's community building too. The neighbours would have to talk to each other and have meetings, etc. There'd be a whole lot of different things. But do you think that we need, are we getting to the point with the energy crisis, fossil fuel crisis, which all the experts tell us got a long tail on it. It's not going to finish when Trump gets bored. But, do we need a federal government kind of mandate here? Because this is in the national interest, for goodness sake. It's not just...
So one of the things we see overseas is when you do have that mandatory disclosure in place, it also not only gives a kind of impact on the market shifting and trying to improve, whether you're trying to improve resale value before you sell, you're buying something that's a bit lower and making those changes, but it also allows the policymakers to have better information about the properties. And so when you're thinking about what are the policy mechanisms that could be enacted to help drive change, you can go, okay, I know what the 10 million houses in Australia are. At the moment, we don't have good information about our housing stock. And so trying to think about what is the best approach or approaches then becomes quite difficult. And so we need better data on our housing.
Yeah.
I think we need
and Ralph, I was just going to ask, what is the data on the housing? How bad is it?
It is poor, very poor. And I think, so when we talk about scaling up retrofit, I think we start by talking about what is the language of retrofit?
Yeah.
How do we elevate, if you like, the discourse so that we know what we're talking about the right things, that this idea of comprehensively understanding your home, of understanding how it performs relative to its local climate, and to other homes in the area, what are the standards expected? That is a crucial first step. Otherwise, we will spend money on homes that we, in an inefficient way. In a sense, we'll do some.
What's the danger there?
Well, I think that we've got such a lot to do. I think we need to make sure that the money, whoever's money it is spent wisely.
Yeah.
And I think while I have nothing against people putting solar panels and batteries, the reality is if you have to oversize those because the fabric is so poor, it doesn't make sense. So how do we make sure that the knowledge is embedded in our society more broadly, not just amongst installers, but also amongst households and decision makers, that allow us to kind of regularize and understand and reach a consensus of what needs to be done?
Yeah.
Because I think that is scaling up. It's scaling up the conversation, and I think that's what's necessary. Once we get to that, then I think it becomes much easier to think about and things like envelope schemes or community-based schemes, or whether it makes sense to identify a whole bunch of houses in a suburb or in a precinct and retrofit them all at the same time, or whether it makes sense to think about the same era of homes across a larger radius and so on, to think about optimizing the effort, how to scale up from the point of view of volumes and reduction in marginal costs and so on. And those decisions can be more readily made when we have the data.
And that sounds like a massive job.
It is.
Getting that data.
Yeah, and we should.
And is the mandatory disclosure the first step in that?
I believe so. I think it's what mandatory disclosure does. It sends signals out to the markets. It also, as Trivess has just said, provides decision makers and policy makers with essential data.
Yeah.
Because if you think about the number of house sales per year and the number of rental rollover of rental agreements, if each one of those has a point of data collection associated with it around property condition, we start to build a database that is instrumental, useful, informative, and which can be used not just by individual renters and households and landlords, but also can be brought together so that we can start to understand sort of larger chunks of the housing stock. And that is really necessary. I think I can't emphasize too much that in all the work we've done, people don't consciously talk about not knowing about their home. Of course, they think they know about their home, but when you start to explore, well, how does it compare with other homes, and you realise that we don't know. Even quite informed people and people who are actively engaged in the home. The other point I wanted to make is that the overlap between what we consider to be and what we're talking about here, which is a kind of implicitly sort of energy efficiency upgrades, and the wider home improvement regime. So I said earlier that everybody's always improving their home, but that could be something that's not related to energy efficiency, quite obviously. So
they're making it prettier,
yeah. They might be
upgrade the kitchen.
They may be making it prettier. They might be, in fact, they may be going in the other direction from energy efficiency. They might be replacing heavy old drapes with really nice, lightweight screens. And that, I'm not seeking to suggest that that's the wrong thing to do. What I'm saying is that home improvements, energy efficiency is part of home improvements, and we can't think about it as a standalone thing. It doesn't make sense for us to think about it as a standalone.
That's interesting.
So if somebody's renovating their bathroom, and they've been saving up $25,000 or whatever it costs to do their bathroom, that's a point in time when a number of things can be bundled together. And the fact that that doesn't happen is because we have this splintered housing retrofit regime where somebody who provides bathrooms doesn't think at all about energy efficiency.
So if they had a blueprint there,
they just want
from some kind of data sort of system that you're talking about, they would say, well, here's the blueprint for when I do the bathroom.
And it's not rocket science. Like we've had your home, we've had all of these Commonwealth initiatives. We know how to do this. We just not, the information is not out there. And it's not presented at the right moment. So I think that what happens so often is people make home improvements that do not take advantage of that moment for energy efficiency. Yeah. So when the next fuel crisis comes and gas prices spike, they're a victim of those instead of being ahead of it and having been able to, when they last did an upgrade, fix up aspects of the home that would have, in effect, future-proofed.
Yeah, and I always remember J.K. Dodson's work that he did at Griffiths, the Vampire Index.
Indeed.
You're living out in the burbs because it's the cheapest home you can get. And then you've got the cost of the energy because it's all built open plan because that's trendy and you see it on TV. And the architects, the home builder designer thinks that's cool. No eaves. Paper thin walls. Oh my God, it goes on. But there is an interesting thing that's happened lately from experts who should know better. It's really interesting. Architects and other people who are very deep into the technology side are saying, well, the grid's about to be decarbonised. South Australia is pretty well decarbonised. Victoria probably will be soon. Tasmania is. We don't have to worry about energy efficiency anymore or the thermal quality of the building because in the couple of months that it's really hot or really cold, you just turn the aircon, the solar on, it's free, But now we've got data centres coming along, which look like blowing our net zero ambitions out of the water. And, suddenly the decarbonised grid looks like it's not going to happen, because one of the things you were saying, Trivess, before is that the skills are already in scarce supply, especially in electricals. And these very wealthy companies will suck all the renewable energy because they need the social licence to operate.
Yeah.
And others will be bereft.
Yeah. So one of the other projects that we're working on at the moment is around resiliency of housing, thinking about future climate change, and it talks exactly to that point. And already there's a couple of research projects in Australia that has looked at the performance of new and existing housing in some of those future climate scenarios.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
What a lot of it suggests is that the housing in the future will perform more poorly than what we see now. And so in terms of trying to deal with that thermal comfort, with a hotter summer in particular, you'll start to see that extended uncomfortable period significantly longer, but also in terms of a high reliance on mechanical cooling to try and maintain thermal comfort. And so if there's an issue with the energy grid, you're stuffed as a householder. But also it doesn't account for then the wider benefits that come from improving the quality of performance.
No.
So improved health and well-being, improved productivity, whole range of other benefits that come. So this, we're largely focusing, I guess, on energy efficiency and kind of sustainability in that way. But there's a whole lot of other benefits for households and the wider community from making these improvements.
Yeah, and this is why I keep thinking that you needed a kind of a national approach, because the states are so tied up and so close to the politics, the local development, and really the housing industry drives a lot of the economy, let's face it. Interest rates go up, suddenly everyone's depressed because price of house. I mean, Melbourne has taxed developers. Housing's got cheaper. And I am now hearing, the ABC had the story the other day, people are moving from Queensland.
Yeah.
First homeowners are coming to Melbourne. It makes sense. They're getting cheaper and they get to go to a beautiful city. But with the housing, did you guys look at apartments?
So not in this project. I've done
Right.
a lot of work on apartments in other projects, and Trivess and I have indeed as well.
Oh, good.
So I'm happy to talk about that. Just before we do, if I'm just going back to your point about the data centres, because I think it's a really important point. I would my comment would be that I think the first imperative we have as a nation is to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. That's the first thing we need to do. We need to do it urgently for the planet, for ourselves, for our own economic prosperity, and for our own what I would call energy sovereignty, energy security, energy sovereignty. If we haven't learned that lesson in the last 3 months, then I don't know when we will. The second thing to say is that renewable energy is good because it's not fossil fuels, but it still costs money.
It does.
Still costs money.
Yeah.
We still have to work out as a nation how we source and develop our renewable energy sources, how we distribute them, who uses that energy, and how we make provision for more when we've come to capacity. Now, that question is a really important and will continue to be an important national question for us forever. And yes, we all want to be able to scroll through social media, apparently, and use data centres and so on and so forth. So we are going to have to work out how we're going to divide the energy, the renewable energy productivity amongst the various different sources of demand. To me, it comes back to a very simple truth. If you can save having to make renewable energy by just designing houses properly or retrofitting them properly, why wouldn't you? They're more comfortable, they're healthier, they provide so many more services, and they cost less.
People used to focus on that entirely. And in recent months, I've heard more and more very senior leaders in the community of sustainability saying, the grid's about to be greened. You don't have to worry about these things. We don't need passive house. It's like another argument against passive house. And I'm going, what about how hot it's going to get? I'd rather be in a temperature-controlled building, whether it's hot or cold. But very interesting. And that argument has somehow been lost. I think we need to bust this myth about the greening of the grid. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, or let's put it this way: the greening of the grid, which must happen,
should happen.
but how big will it be, and how much will it be able to provide, and what are going to be the sources
and we will still need
what
energy
are the sources
efficiency.
of demand?
Yeah.
So I do tend to agree, and I actually am a fan of microgrids. I think that we should be thinking about, as are other overseas jurisdictions, about how we break the hegemony, if you like, of the national grid, and we actually have microgrids where we can generate and share and distribute energy locally, without having to invest large amounts of capital in high voltage cables, which enable us to get savings out of that kind of traditional approach, and in that regard, you really want to make sure, if you want to use your neighbour's excess solar energy during the day to charge your car because you don't need it during the day, then not only do we need sources of exchange, but we also need to think about what those peak demand and supply exchanges are going to look like. Now, energy efficiency has to play a role there as a negative energy cost. So I don't think it goes away. I think it continues to feature. It may marginally change the decision point at which we think about what types of energy efficiency retrofits to do at any particular stage, but it's not going to go away.
No, that's a really great point. Microgrids, it just makes so much sense. I can't see anything beating that as a piece of logic.
Sorry, I interrupted you when you started talking about apartments.
Well, I would like to hear about apartments, because apparently more than half are already, nearly half are living in apartments.
Indeed. Well, and certainly in terms of the new build, the contribution to our housing stock each year is disproportionately apartments compared to the current mix. So yes, more and more of us are, or more and more of the housing stock is apartments, and they do offer a very different set of challenges to retrofit from houses that sit on their own patch of dirt. Yeah.
So that's another something else you'll be working on, you think?
I think. Yes.
What's the next project?
I think there's, where do you start with cladding and who knows what else, some of which is blown up in our collective faces, if you like, as a global community. So
what do you mean?
Well, I mean, I think in Grenfell, the tragedies that have occurred due to what we now know as being sloppy approaches to trying to improve energy efficiency.
Well, actually, outright fraud in the case of Grenfell.
Indeed, nobody's been charged.
They never do. Bridges collapse, stadiums collapse. Yeah. No one ever goes to court or gets. Yeah, it's funny though.
So absolutely. I mean, if there's an imperative to get the National Construction Code new housing energy efficiency standards right, it's in apartments. Because just we know that orders of magnitude of difficulty in going back to an apartment where you've split up the ownership arrangements, where you've got, all kinds of intermediaries that you don't have with standalone dwellings. Basically, the level of complexity is much higher. So you really need to make sure that you're, to quote the adage, a stitch in time saves none, that you get the apartment block first time best you can. And I think that points to us making sure that design, energy efficiency and so on are up front and centre when we're putting up new buildings.
Kind of a mini version of what you were saying before, Trivess, about doing things in a block. I mean, literally a block there.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's examples from overseas where they've been able to go in and go through a whole apartment block and do so relatively quickly with relatively low impact.
With existing apartments, you mean? Yeah.
And in that process, there's even some examples where they've improved kind of functionality and livability, but largely improving kind of quality and performance. Yes.
Did you get a sense when you were interviewing people and doing this work that it needed government support? And if so, how much? I mean...
Yeah, so I think whenever you ask somebody what would prompt them to kind of do something more. They always come back with, any other support, particularly financial, is always welcomed. There are certainly some challenges around the financing of some of these things. We were talking about double glazed windows earlier. That could be $40,000 to kind of retrofit a property, and so that's a big impact on a household who might already be struggling with cost of living. There's certainly some very low cost options, insulation being one of those lower cost options for retrofitting. So it's not that everything is expensive, but I think we need to think about how do we innovate around those costings. And we already see it where some of the banks offer pauses on kind of mortgage repayments to help.
They're tiny though, aren't they? They're small incentives.
Yes, but I guess it's an example of something we could be doing in that space. I think the government's role, at least in my perspective, is to help try and bring these things to Australia and to try and develop that kind of industry there. So again, if we go the double glazed windows example again, is the industry there ready to scale up when the demand is there, and is that something the government could be trying to help with? But it's an interesting one, because what we see in these schemes is it's often those who are most able to participate to begin with are the ones that get the biggest benefits. So things like the batteries, the solar, and so forth. Yeah, it's often going to those who already were probably reasonably well off, and those who are less well off are kind of left behind. Now, you hope the market brings down the cost as things scale up and they kind of get picked up in the end. But I think there is some need for some protection around.
Yeah, two things there I think I'd like to ask both of you about is that, in John Howard's time, they mandated minimum standards for energy efficiency, 4.5-star neighbours, for government property, whether it was owned or leased. It transformed the industry. It actually was market transformation because it was mandated. So suddenly everything got cheaper and available. Now, what is stopping the government doing the same for new houses and apartments and retrofits? And the other thing is EUAs. I don't know whether you looked at that method, environmental upgrade agreements, which somehow never got off the ground. So then we're running out of time. So maybe we could, sort of think on some solutions. What do you think, Ralph?
I think mandating is crucial in the sense that regulations are the cheapest way to do things generally. If everybody has to do
cheapest way, that's interesting, because you'll have the HIA and NBA, screaming blue murder that it's cheap. But
I
cheaper,
think, Well, if I go back to that 5-star study in 2005, I will say that some of these construction member bodies were at the time saying this is going to bankrupt Australian households, and the research that was done, not by me, after the introduction of the so-called 5-star minimum energy efficiency standard showed that was completely wrong.
Yeah.
In reality, we maybe saw $300 or so increase in the cost of new housing per dwelling. It's lost in the noise.
Because they get clever at finding out ways to benefit themselves. So, of course,
ingenuity comes into play, strangely, and that will continue to happen. And I think, given that the rest of the world is so far ahead of Australia, so far ahead on new construction in terms of energy efficiency, it's not rocket science for us to get there. It's not rocket science.
We could borrow some ideas.
We could borrow ideas and Australianize them. I think there's frankly no excuses as to why we aren't building 7, 8, 9-star new homes, and why we're not doing more to address those opportunities when people are investing in existing dwellings. One thing I wanted to say here is that, yes, we have a strong focus in Australia on home ownership. And dare I say, I think, one of the logics of any changes that might be coming around capital gains and so on is to kind of readjust things so that home ownership is again established as, the right of every Australian household. That does not mean that our homes across Australia are simply a matter of private interest. Okay? Because let everybody do whatever they want. If they want to live in a wooden shed with no insulation, it's up to them. I don't think that logic follows, because the reality is our housing stock is incredibly long lasting. So we outlive our the home outlives the household. The home gets passed on to different households.
It's part of our infrastructure
and it's
as a
part
nation,
of our
isn't it?
infrastructure as a nation. Precisely. That's exactly what I was going to say. Thank you.
Yes, I know. Sorry.
And it does mean, in my view, that we have a responsibility to regulate and to manage the stock in a way as it is collective infrastructure, as well as it being something that is providing, that individual investment and home for the household. So I think you can carry both of those, and it means we have to have a mix of incentive measures, but also measures which are universal and which we have in order to reduce costs, improve understanding and standards and practices and so on, and improve ultimately the lot of the housing stock for everyone over intergenerational the intergenerational future. Hence, I do think we should be thinking about future climate, and we should be designing for future climates.
Absolutely. And so, Trivess, what about EUAs? Did you look into that? So, if you could explain you're familiar with them, are you?
Yeah,
or both of you.
Handball this one to
okay.
Sure. So, I think the idea that you invest in energy upgrades on the basis that there will be lower bills coming, and that those lower bills can be serviced through the loan. In other words, that you've got green elements in your
through the rates, the initial the rates. Yeah.
Either of these. I think I'm not a policy expert, and so I'm not here to say how precisely these mechanisms should work, but I absolutely see no problem with linking up. Given that many building occupiers, never mind households, are only going to stay in that dwelling for or that building for a particular period of time, and those benefits are going to outlast that period.
Same as what you were just saying about a national interest.
It makes sense to extend the payback period by having products like you say, energy upgrade agreements and the like, that enable the financial mechanisms to play out over time. Otherwise, there are barriers to entry, and we need a lot less barriers to entry because we're facing this really, I think, a crisis where the number of retrofits are nowhere near what they need to be.
In a way, as you were just talking, it made me realise, I think that, is it any different to paying for the connection of water to your property? You pay for part of the infrastructure long term so that everyone benefits, then you pay for the water. But for some reason, we've disconnected housing and turned it into a private sector thing that has nothing to do with government, and they put in what they want, apart from the minimum standards, which sometimes don't even get met.
Yeah, look, I think there's more to say on this, but I think from the point of view of our research, what we're hoping to do here is to really emphasise these elements that haven't been brought to the fore about how this decision making around energy retrofits are complex. They're part of so many other things that are happening, and regulation and standards play an absolutely crucial and central role, as does mandatory disclosure, dare I say.
Yeah. Very good.
It's front and centre to what we need.
So what are your closing comments here? Because I've taken up a lot of your time. What would you like to see?
I think we need better data for households as a starting point. I think that data needs to be trusted and independent. We need to be building up a retrofit industry to be able to deliver retrofits and holistic retrofits at scale. And we don't have a moment to lose. We need to be doing this quickly. We need to not waste any more time.
We've had a lot of short-term programs. I'm not against any programs, but I think a more consistent approach would obviously help the industry, would help households. If it's not get your solar battery right now because this is only going to be here for a few weeks. I think that that leads to a kind of, dare I say, dysfunctional set of kind of market investment type arrangements that won't necessarily lead us to the kind of optimal outcomes we're looking for. So while I'm not criticizing any of those programs, I do think longer term, more consistent, better information is going to help us. If you think about appliance labeling, I come back to, the humble fridge or dishwasher or washing machine, and it's a simple labeling scheme. It mainly works for the purposes of what households need in order to make decisions. What's the equivalent of that for housing?
Yeah, very good. Anyway, that was fantastic insights. Really, really good. Thank you both very much.
Thank you
for having us.